In a tense courtroom, a 10-year-old boy points at the judge and declares, "You're the killer," leaving everyone in stunned silence. The wooden doors of the grand courtroom groaned open, their weight echoing against the marble floors, sending a cold shiver through the hushed gallery. The room, a towering testament to justice and power, seemed to breathe in unison with the assembled spectators, all waiting for what they already knew to be a farce of due process. And yet, for all its grandeur, all its promise of impartiality, the air within the courtroom felt heavy, suffocating, thick with something unseen, but deeply felt. It was the weight of predetermined fates, of silent deals exchanged in corridors beyond the public eye, of a system that had long since traded truth for convenience. Through those doors stepped a boy, small, fragile, a silhouette against the overwhelming vastness of the judicial arena. Daniel Reyes, only 10 years old, his frame delicate but his presence impossible to ignore, walked forward with deliberate, measured steps. The courtroom swallowed him in its vastness, the cold marble pillars standing like watchmen, silent and indifferent to the battle unfolding within. He did not cower, nor did he falter. His eyes, dark pools of grief and knowledge, carried something far beyond his years. A child should not wear such an expression, the kind that speaks of loss too great to comprehend, of truths far too dangerous to hold. His gaze, unflinching, found the man seated at the highest bench, the one who wielded the ultimate power in this proceeding. Judge Marcus Holloway, a figure of undisputed authority, a man of prestige whose name was synonymous with untouchability. The black robes draped over him were not a symbol of justice but of dominion, a mantle he had worn for decades, shaping the law as he saw fit. His face betrayed nothing as he observed the child before him, his expression carved from stone, unreadable, impenetrable. His gavel, smooth and polished from years of rendering decisions that benefited only those with influence, rested within his grasp. A weapon disguised as an instrument of justice. The case laid before him was one that had been set in motion long before the first piece of evidence had been filed, before the first witness had been sworn in, before the victim had even drawn his last breath. The murder of Hector Reyes had not been a crime of passion, nor an act of randomness. It had been deliberate, calculated, an erasure of a man whose only offense had been seeking the truth. A journalist who had refused to look the other way, who had dug too deep, who had unearthed names that were never meant to be spoken. Officially, the death had been labeled an accident, a tragic misfortune that no amount of investigation could undo. Unofficially, it was a warning, a message scrawled in blood for those who dared to follow in his footsteps. In this city, those who spoke too much had a habit of vanishing, their voices silenced before they could echo too far. Across the courtroom, seated behind polished mahogany desks that gleamed under the oppressive glow of the chandeliers, the defense team watched with expressions that ranged from boredom to mild amusement. Men who had spent their careers maneuvering through the labyrinth of the legal system, not by virtue of skill or righteousness, but through well-placed alliances and promises exchanged in whispered conversations behind locked doors. Leading them was State Prosecutor Victor Langston, a man whose reputation was built not on upholding justice, but on ensuring its selective application. He bore the air of a man who already knew the outcome before the trial had even begun, a smug confidence radiating from his every calculated movement. He and his team did not fear the proceedings, for they had been designed in their favor. They represented Senator Charles Whitaker, a figure of immense power, a man whose name carried weight in the corridors of government, whose reach extended beyond the limits of any courtroom. He was the one facing accusations, the one whose hands had allegedly orchestrated the murder of Hector Reyes. But in the shadows, behind the carefully constructed facade of legal battles and public scrutiny, the whispers spoke of something deeper, something far more sinister. The senator was merely a piece on a larger board, a pawn moved by hands far more dangerous than his own. The corruption did not stop with him, it merely began there, trickling upward into the highest ranks of power, where names were spoken only in hushed tones, where decisions were made behind veils of secrecy. Daniel was never meant to be here. His presence on the witness stand was not part of the carefully laid plans, not an element that had been accounted for when the pieces had first been set in motion. A child was unpredictable, a factor that could not be controlled through intimidation or manipulation. His testimony, if allowed, could fracture the illusion that had been so meticulously crafted. The system had not prepared for him because it had never needed to. But then, 2 weeks ago, something had changed. A package, unmarked and unexpected, had arrived at the door of Elliot Grayson, a defense attorney whose name was not spoken with reverence, but with frustration among those who preferred cases to be decided before they even reached trial. He was not a man of wealth or prestige, not someone who had risen through the ranks by aligning himself with the powerful. He was worn down but relentless, a man who had seen too much and refused to look away. He had fought cases that others had deemed unwinnable, not because he believed in victory, but because he believed in truth. Inside the package was evidence, real, damning, undeniable, not just against Senator Whitaker, but against the unseen forces that had shielded him. It had taken Grayson less than an hour to understand the weight of what he had received, and even less time to realize the danger that came with it. The sender remained anonymous, their motives unknown, but their intent was clear. Someone, somewhere, wanted the truth to be heard. And so, against every warning, against every threat that had come in the days following, Grayson had done the unthinkable. He had put the boy on the witness list. And now, Daniel Reyes stood in the center of the courtroom, the weight of his father's legacy pressing upon his small shoulders, the eyes of men who wanted him silenced drilling into him from every direction. He was only a child, and yet he carried with him the potential to unravel the very foundation upon which these men had built their power. His voice had not yet been heard, his words had not yet been spoken, but already the courtroom could feel the shift. The tension was no longer a quiet undercurrent, but a living thing, pressing against the walls, seeping into the air. For the first time in a long time, there was an uncertainty that the men in power had not accounted for. Daniel Reyes had come to speak, and nothing in the world could stop him now. Grayson moved with steady determination as he led Daniel to the witness stand, his presence a shield against the oppressive weight of the courtroom's unspoken threats. The boy, though small in stature, walked with a resolve that sent ripples through the room, a force that could not be ignored despite the attempts to keep him silent. The tension, already thick from the moment he had stepped through the grand doors, seemed to solidify, growing heavier with each step toward the elevated stand where his words would soon alter the course of everything. As they reached the wooden seat, Grayson placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder, a silent message that even in this den of wolves, the boy was not alone. The objection had come swiftly from the defense, as expected, their voices sharp, their reasoning laced with the arrogance of men who had never known true resistance. They had argued that a child's testimony could only be emotionally driven, unreliable, irrelevant. They had masked their fear behind procedure, citing rules, precedents, and any technicality that might keep Daniel's voice from being heard. But despite the resistance, despite the barely concealed attempts to erase his presence from the proceedings, Judge Holloway had allowed it. The decision had come with reluctance, with hesitation, with a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Whether it had been the pressure of the room, the optics of denying the last living witness tied to the victim, or something deeper, something concealed beneath the layers of power he had carefully constructed, was unknown. But the gavel had not yet fallen, and for the moment, Daniel had his chance to speak. The wooden chair groaned slightly as he climbed into it, his small hands gripping the edges of the armrests, steadying himself as all eyes fell upon him. The courtroom, already tense, seemed to shrink, every breath held, every movement stilled as the moment stretched in unbearable anticipation. His dark eyes lifted, locking onto the figure seated at the highest bench, the man who had spent decades rendering judgment upon others, who now found himself at the center of the very reckoning he had long avoided. Daniel inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he was about to do. Then, with a voice that did not waver, he spoke. He asked the question that cut through the courtroom like a blade, slicing through the false decorum, through the illusion of control. He asked about his father, about the connection that had existed between Hector Reyes and the man who now sat in judgment. Judge Holloway barely reacted. His expression remained carefully neutral, a mask that had been perfected over years of calculated rulings, of balancing power and optics with effortless precision. His response came without hesitation, dismissive in its tone, brushing aside the question as irrelevant to the proceedings, as though the personal connection to the murdered journalist carried no weight in a trial built around that very murder. But Daniel did not falter. His voice pressed forward, steady and unwavering, slicing through the murmurs that began to ripple through the gallery, through the legal teams seated on either side. He spoke of trust, of his father's belief that Holloway had once been a man of integrity, a man who sought justice rather than controlled it. He spoke of the faith that had been placed in the wrong hands, faith that had led to betrayal. And then, the moment came. The words, sharp and damning, echoed through the courtroom with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the trial. He accused the judge outright, stripping away the veil of authority, revealing the truth that had remained hidden beneath layers of manipulation and power. The words did not hesitate, did not ask for permission. They came as a hammer, slamming into the carefully constructed narrative that had shielded those in control for so long. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp rippled through the room, disbelief and shock cracking through the polished expressions of the attorneys, the jury, the spectators who had come expecting a predetermined outcome. Even the bailiff, a man who had stood motionless through countless trials, took an involuntary step forward, as though unsure whether intervention was required, as though uncertain whether this moment had already spiraled beyond the reach of procedure. Judge Holloway's fingers, which had rested with practiced ease upon the gavel, curled around it now, gripping the polished wood with force. But for the first time in his career, for the first time in all his years of wielding absolute control, he did not bring it down. The hesitation, brief but undeniable, spread through the room like a crack in an otherwise impenetrable wall. His voice, when it came, was measured, calculated, wrapped in the authority that had always commanded obedience. He warned the boy of the gravity of his words, of the danger in such accusations, the unspoken threat woven carefully into the syllables. But the words that had once silenced countless others, that had buried truths before they could ever see the light, held no power here. Daniel did not flinch. He did not shrink beneath the weight of the judge's presence, did not cower beneath the eyes of men who had built their careers on controlling the narrative. Instead, he pressed forward, his voice unwavering, his words cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. He spoke of what he had found, of the discovery made 2 weeks prior, hidden within the remnants of his father's work. A secret buried not by accident, but out of necessity. A truth too dangerous to be known until the right moment. He turned toward Grayson, his silent cue sending a fresh wave of tension through the room. The attorney, his own expression a mask of quiet determination, reached into his pocket and withdrew the small device. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he pressed play, and then the voice of Hector Reyes filled the room. The sound was unmistakable, the clarity undeniable. It was not the voice of a man speculating, not the voice of a man uncertain. It was the voice of a man who had known his fate long before it had come, who had seen the noose tightening around him and had done the only thing left to do. He had left behind the truth, a confession not of his own sins, but of the sins of the man who had condemned him. The recording carried the weight of inevitability, the final words of a man who had understood that justice would not come for him, but that perhaps, one day, it could come for those who remained. The names spoken were not vague, not hidden behind implication. They were clear, spoken with conviction. It was not the senator. It was not the prosecutor. It was not any of the expected culprits, the figures placed before the court as a distraction from the true source of corruption. It was the judge. The walls of the courtroom seemed to press inward, the space growing smaller, suffocating under the weight of the revelation. The defense team remained frozen, their carefully crafted expressions slipping, their confidence fracturing beneath the undeniable proof that had just been played for all to hear. The gallery erupted in whispers, hushed voices struggling to process what had just been laid bare before them. And yet, amidst the chaos, amidst the realization that the courtroom was no longer under his control, Judge Holloway remained still. His hand remained wrapped around the gavel, his expression frozen in place. He did not react. He did not rise. But for the first time, he had no defense. Panic rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave, shattering the controlled atmosphere that had existed mere moments before. Holloway's face remained an unreadable mask, but his fingers clenched around the gavel, his knuckles whitening as the weight of the revelation crashed over the room. The recording still seemed to echo in the minds of those who had heard it, the voice of Hector Reyes refusing to be silenced even in death. The murmurs rose into a frenzy, a swelling tide of disbelief and outrage that the judge could no longer contain. With a sharp motion, he slammed the gavel down, the sound cracking through the chaos like a gunshot, demanding order. But the power he had wielded for so long, the authority that had once kept this courtroom obedient, was slipping. The murmurs did not die. They only grew louder. At the prosecution's table, Langston leaned in toward Whitaker, his expression no longer one of smug certainty, but of urgent calculation. The whispered exchange between them was hurried, frantic, as though they were already mapping out an escape route from the storm brewing around them. The weight of what had just been exposed was too great to dismiss, too damning to brush aside with legal maneuvering. They needed a new plan, and they needed it fast. But even as they conspired in hushed voices, their gazes kept darting toward the back of the room, toward the men in suits who had remained eerily silent throughout the trial. Daniel noticed them too. Their presence had been easy to overlook at first, blending into the sea of spectators, but now their movements betrayed them. These were not ordinary observers. They were men who carried themselves with the kind of control that came from wielding real power, the kind that operated outside the confines of any courtroom. Federal agents, government officials, figures who had come not to witness justice, but to ensure that the truth never left these walls. Then, without warning, everything erupted. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a force that sent a jolt through the assembled crowd. The sudden commotion sent a fresh wave of panic surging through the room as uniformed figures stormed inside. U.S. Marshals, their movements precise, their expressions unreadable, pushed their way forward, their presence cutting through the chaos with unmistakable intent. But as they moved past the defense table, past the prosecution, past even the man seated at the judge's bench, it became immediately clear. They weren't here for Holloway. They were heading straight for Grayson and Daniel. One of them stepped forward, a high-ranking badge flashing in his grip, his voice carrying above the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. He spoke with the cold efficiency of someone who was merely following orders, someone who had no interest in the trial itself, only in silencing the problem it had created. The situation, he declared, was now a matter of national security. Daniel Reyes was no longer a witness. He was an asset to be taken into custody. Grayson moved before Daniel could react, his body shifting instinctively to shield the boy from the approaching officers. His stance, rigid with defiance, made it clear that he had no intention of allowing them to lay a hand on Daniel. His words came sharp and unyielding, his voice carrying the raw defiance of a man who had fought too hard, lost too much, to back down now. He was not going to let them take him. Not like this. The air grew thicker, charged with the weight of an impending standoff. The marshals, trained in handling resistance, showed no hesitation as they continued their approach, their formation unbroken. It was not the first time they had been sent to retrieve someone deemed too dangerous to remain free. But even as they prepared to move forward, something unexpected happened. A single figure stepped into their path. The bailiff, a man who had spent his career maintaining order within these walls, who had remained an impartial enforcer of the court's will, moved at last. Not toward Daniel, not toward Grayson, but toward the doors. Without a word, he reached out, gripping the handles with firm resolve, and then, in a single motion, he pulled them shut. The heavy lock clicked into place. For the first time since the chaos began, true silence fell over the courtroom. Every eye turned toward the bailiff, toward the man who had, in an instant, shifted the course of events. His face, lined with years of witnessing the slow decay of justice, held no hesitation, no uncertainty. He had seen enough. He had played his part in this system for long enough. And now, with the truth finally laid bare, he was done. The weight of his decision was made clear as he reached up, fingers grasping at the badge pinned to his uniform. With deliberate slowness, he pulled it free, holding it for a fraction of a second before letting it fall to the floor. The metallic clatter rang out in the silence, an unmistakable act of defiance. a final rejection of the corruption that had poisoned this courtroom for too long. The jury sat frozen, caught between disbelief and realization. The defense and prosecution remained still, knowing that whatever happened next would be beyond their control. The marshals hesitated, their once certain orders now muddled by the unpredictable shift in allegiance. And at the highest bench, where he had once commanded absolute power, Holloway's expression darkened. He was watching his dominion crumble, watching as the walls of control he had spent decades constructing began to fracture. He was no longer the judge in this room. He was the accused. For the first time, Holloway understood. Control was slipping from his grasp. The courtroom descended into chaos, the once orderly proceedings fracturing into a battlefield where allegiances were tested and long-buried frustrations erupted to the surface. Some officers, bound by duty or fear, moved to detain Daniel, their hands reaching for the boy as if silencing him would somehow undo the truth that had already been exposed. Others, those who had spent years watching justice bend and break under the weight of corruption, hesitated. They were tired of the lies, tired of the charade, and for the first time, they refused to be complicit. The gallery, filled with reporters, legal observers, and citizens who had expected a trial, now swelled with outrage. Shouts echoed against the marble walls, a tidal wave of voices demanding accountability, demanding answers, demanding something more than the hollow performances that had long defined this place. Some called for Holloway's resignation, others for his immediate arrest. But amidst the uproar, amidst the growing realization that this trial had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, there was one voice that rose above the rest. Grayson did not back down. He stood his ground, his presence unyielding even as the courtroom teetered on the brink of losing all control. His voice cut through the clamor, his words not a plea, but a demand. He called Holloway by name, forcing the weight of responsibility onto the judge, refusing to let him slip away under the cover of confusion. The accusations had been made. The evidence had been played. The people in this room had heard the truth with their own ears, had seen the cracks in the foundation of the justice system laid bare before them. And now, there could be no turning back. But Holloway was not a man who crumbled under pressure. Decades of power had shaped him into something immovable, something beyond the reach of ordinary consequences. He did not waver. He did not cower. Instead, as if the very idea of facing repercussions was absurd, he smiled. It was a slow, knowing expression, one that carried no fear, no uncertainty, only the cold amusement of a man who understood the game far better than those who dared to challenge him. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, a sound only Daniel could hear. The words he spoke were not an explanation, not a justification, but a revelation of the truth that had ruled this courtroom long before the boy had ever stepped foot inside. Justice had never been about truth. It had never been about right or wrong. It had always been about control. Then, without hesitation, he lifted the gavel and brought it down in 3 deliberate strikes. The sharp cracks silenced the room, not because order had been restored, but because something final had been declared. The weight of those 3 strikes, the finality of the motion, sent a clear message. This was over. Not because justice had been served, but because the one who controlled the outcome had decided it was time to walk away. Holloway rose from his seat with the same unshaken authority he had carried when the trial first began. He did not look at the jury, nor at the prosecution or defense. He did not acknowledge the chaos unraveling around him, nor the agents still arguing over what to do next. He moved with the certainty of a man who knew he would never face consequences, a man who understood that no matter how damning the evidence, no matter how loud the protests, he would never be held accountable. Before anyone could react, before the realization could fully settle over the room, a side door behind the judge's bench swung open. It had been there all along, an unnoticed escape route built into the very design of the courthouse. And without so much as a backward glance, Holloway stepped through it, disappearing into the labyrinth of hallways that stretched beyond the public's reach, slipping effortlessly into the machinery of corruption that had long protected him. Daniel remained frozen in place. He had come here expecting justice, believing that truth had the power to change things, to make those responsible answer for their crimes. And yet, the man who had taken his father from him had just walked free. The system that was supposed to deliver justice had, instead, revealed itself for what it truly was: a shield for those in power, a weapon wielded against those who dared to challenge it. The room exploded once more, voices rising, demands turning into anger, into disbelief. Some of the federal agents remained locked in argument, others moving toward Grayson and Daniel, uncertain now of whether their orders still stood. The gallery swarmed with movement, reporters scrambling to capture the moment, knowing that what had just happened was bigger than any single trial. The officers who had hesitated before now seemed paralyzed, caught between the laws they were supposed to uphold and the reality that those laws had just been rendered meaningless. But amidst the storm, amidst the voices and the movement and the weight of betrayal pressing down on him, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't over.